let's get started. Let me start with a very, very simple question, but I'm going somewhere with it, which is that my first question is, what was your reaction to the death of Raisi and Abdollahian? And I will be so bold as to share my own first to get things kicked off. And the reason I asked the question is because, first of all, obviously I did a double take. What is this, a joke? What's happening? And then I thought, this could be really big if this is real. And I didn't think it could be really big necessarily because of these two people and whoever else was on the helicopter dying, but because of the possibly predictable repercussions of what could happen. As I was saying in the intro there, something can trigger other things, which can trigger other things. And so a series of events could lead to a very animated kind of change of scenario, both in Iran and around the world for Iranians. So it was with a cocked eye that I sort of went, wow, this could be something big. Bahador, your first reaction to the death of Raisi and Abdollahian?
I was definitely not sad. I was excited to know more. I would say that. I wasn't celebrating. I personally don't think it's worth celebrating because everything will just go on. Nothing in terms of the Islamic Republic is changing. So for me personally, I don't think it's something to celebrate. But I was really, really enthusiastic to dig into it, to find out more. And I still think there's a lot more to it that we don't know.
Cameron?
This may get me in trouble, but I was hoping that he was alive or that he would survive. And that's for two reasons. The first of which is because I think for the crimes that he has committed, which are, as all of us know, so vast and so, in many instances, unspeakable, this was really an easy ending, I think. And he truly deserved to face a trial, a fair trial by the people of Iran for the crimes he's committed against them. That was the first reason. The second reason was, as was alluded to, and I'm sure we'll discuss a bit going forward, I don't think that this changes much in the short, medium, or even maybe long terms. And so to have all this attention paid to the issue can certainly highlight some of what's going on inside Iran, the Iranian people's democratic aspirations. But I just thought him dying in this way would give a lot of attention to the issue without sort of much ado about nothing. And so I hope that he would survive to face justice, true justice, at the hands of the Iranian people. And also, it was a lot of excitement that I don't think will lead to much significant change in the regime's behavior.
Pegah, your first reaction to the death of Raisi and Abdullahian. We'll throw him in there with that. Yeah.
I think my first reaction was actually a lot more cynical than everything I've kind of heard from our panel here. First off, I've been kind of conditioned to not believe so much of what comes out of Iran. There's always so many falsifications of what really happens, what doesn't happen, things like that. So at first I just was kind of like, I'm going to wait and see, because who knows if this is true or not true or whatever else. And then in terms of having in the back of my mind that, whether it's Raisi or Abdollahian or whoever else was on that helicopter was actually dead, I kind of had a similar reaction to it. It was kind of like, it's not going to change anything. So, good riddance, but what is it going to change?
Nazenin?
Well, I had been following the news from the day before, and it was just like a thriller. 3 helicopters, 2 returning home, 1 not, and then looking at all the preparations inside Iran. As far as it happened on the day of the birthday of the 8th Imam, but as well, there were crowds gathering already, wearing black. There were TV presenters that were already wearing black. It was the first time that the supreme leader, within a few hours, was on on TV, but his demeanor was not like what we had seen before, with Qasem Soleimani, Commander Soleimani, where he was crying. This time he was trying to project a sense of calm, and then learning bit by bit that actually one minister at the end was, suddenly before the flights had taken off, they had asked him to change the helicopters, And so, in a sense, when the news came, it was, yes, well, it was to be expected. And I have lived through the Islamic Republic regime for a long time. And the first president of the Islamic Republic, Bani Sad, had to flee the country. Then we had Mousavi, who was is still under house arrest. You had another one, the second one, Rajoy, who was killed in a bombing. Then you had also Mr. Rafsanjani, who died. So I think it's a poison chalice for anybody who wants to become the next president. But the movement of what's happening around inside the power circles is very interesting indeed. And I do appreciate, as far as the situation between the regime versus the people, that we are not seeing any movement there at the moment. But within the regime itself, you are seeing a kind of division, a division that we
Let's get to that. Let's get to that. Well, first, let me stick with you, Nazanin, and just to follow up on exactly what you were saying. Well, one of the things that the immediate conversation, I'm sure this is true for all of you guys with your families or friends, both in Iran and outside. One of the conversations we immediately have, and it plays to what you're saying, Pegah, about not necessarily believing either that the events are happening or that the events are happening the way we're being told, is, for lack of a better way to put it, because it sort of sounds pejorative, and I don't mean it that way, but conspiracy theories. We all sort of go, everybody, the dinner conversation becomes, which is a little, becomes, different theories on what's actually happening. How did this happen? Which is a little bit of, the shiny object that is not actually what we should be talking about to a certain extent, but it certainly dominates the conversation. And in this case, it does seem kind of absurd. We're always conditioned to think that the this Islamic Republic regime it's like Keystone Cops. They're a bunch of bumbling, idiots. And so, of course, there was an accident. And at the same time, it just seems really bizarre. I mean, you can't imagine, can you imagine, God forbid, but the Canadian Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister both died in a helicopter crash. It doesn't make any sense in any context except when it comes to Iran. And you go, well, yeah, of course. And I've learned that, so sadly, so much of what happens in the Iranian space is almost like a Homeland episode. It's if you think of the most devious or worst kind of scenario of what could be happening behind the scenes, it usually is. And in a very sad and macabre way with Flight 752, where at first it was like, no, this can't be happening. At second, it was like, well, this is an accident. And then finally, the worst, most macabre answers came to light. So in this case, was it an accident? And further, Nazanin, John, you take this first. Does it really matter if it was or not?
Well, it does show it, whether it was an accident or not, but it is showing the cracks within the regime. We had seen, in the participation of elections, for example, in the last parliamentary elections, there was under 30%. Then 10 days ago, when there were the runoffs, there was less than 8%, and the highest the candidate with the highest vote in Tehran, of a population of 8 million, received less than 400,000 votes. So you see that, but also you see what we are observing are the fierce battles between the fundamentalists themselves, that they have split into factions, 3 factions, big factions specifically. And I think for us, when we look at it, you see, for example, Mr. Ghalibaf, who was an IRGC leader, mayor of Tehran, who was supposed to run against Raisi in the last elections, but withdrew so that Raisi would win. He came fourth in the parliamentary elections, but now for the new elections, he's one of the 3 preparing the grounds for the new elections. So It is. I mean, and today, just a few hours ago, a new video has emerged of the last cabinet meeting of Mr. Raisi, where he is actually saying, you know, silence, 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 and he refers to disagreements and says that his leader, who he follows, actually he doesn't name Ayatollah Khamenei, but Ayatollah Beheshti, who was killed. He was considered as one of the pro-West Ayatollahs, who was blown up in the first MEK explosions in Iran.
So Nazanin,
So,
it wouldn't be, it sounds like what you're saying is, it wouldn't be shocking to you if one faction of the regime had sort of plotted for this to happen and for these to eliminate these guys.
I'm telling you, it's a thriller. I mean, all the elements are there. I mean, every day, bit by bit of information is coming up, and it's not pointing to an accident as such.
Cameron, if that's true, or it's certainly a possibility, I mean, none of us really know, is that consequential? I mean, sometimes we talk about how, everyone in this regime, this Islamic Republic is really as bad as the rest of them. So what difference does it really make? Is it something that we should be focusing on? Does it make a difference if it was an accident or not?
It does make a difference, and I think there are 3 or 4 possible explanations for why this happened. First of all, Jian, you said the Islamic Republic is sort of like Homeland. I would say it's something like a combination of Homeland and Veep, because if you watch the attempted rescue missions, I mean, it was really Keystone Cops like. It was embarrassing for the regime, and I think you see these people. You have a cleric, this like 300-pound supposedly military officer pointing at maps, and they can't even find where this thing is. They have to ask another country to come and help. They can't find their own president inside their own country, and he's on. I mean, it's shocking. So I think there are 3 or 4 possible reasons that this happened, and I'll answer your question specifically. The first of which is that this was something of an accident. It's still possible, of course. We can't say that's not a possibility. If you consider the fact that Raisi and Abdollahian, first of all, the fact that they were even flying together, this would not happen in any advanced country. You would never put the foreign minister and the president of your country on the same helicopter. And I think it just shows how little value the Islamic Republic system, how little value Ali Khamenei places on these lackeys, on these functionaries that on the world stage are seen as the foreign minister or the president, but they really have no value. And that's shown by the fact that there are no safety precautions taken, and they can be sent, the 2 of them, what are supposedly senior government ministers, in the same helicopter, a helicopter purchased nearly 50 years ago, no less, by the previous regime, an American helicopter. So it's possible that it was old, faulty machinery, perhaps combined with the weather. It could be an accident. I don't think so, but it's possible. The second is some element of foreign interference. The third is what we're discussing now, is some element, some amount of inter-regime rivalry, a plot, taking out a rival. The fourth is potentially combined with the third, but some elements more opposed to the regime. We can get a bit into that later, but to your point about the third possibility, if this was some sort of inter-regime plot, it makes much more sense when you think about Ebrahim Raisi as a contender to take over the top job of supreme leader than if you think about him as just the president, because as just the president, he's largely irrelevant. But if you think about him as a rival to Mojtaba Khamenei to take over the supreme leadership, then it becomes much more likely. And I do think that it matters, and I do think that it presents opportunities for whether it's the West, whether it's those of us who are opposed to the Islamic Republic, because one of the goals, I think, of any opposition to the Islamic Republic should be to try to bring about defections from within the regime. And when you see the regime weakened, when you see rifts within the regime, I think it's only wise to try to expedite those shifts, to try to augment those differences within the regime.
Yeah, I just when I hear, I mean, Nazanin John puts it really well when she says it's like a thriller, but we don't want it to be like a thriller, right? We don't want to we don't want to watch this as if it's entertainment, and for that to be the focus, a bunch of social media, scavenger hunt about, whether this was an accident or not, as opposed to exposing these guys for who they are, or for what has been happening with the Iranian people for many years. Cameron, I was still with you. If you want to respond to that.
That's right. I mean, it's not that. That's why I sort of said at the beginning, my hope was that he would be alive, because then we have to get into all this Monday morning quarterbacking, what really happened. The only reason to me that it matters as to what really happened, because as I was saying at the end, if there are factions within the regime who are breaking off, who are showing rifts, and if those can be exploited to the benefit of the Iranian people to facilitate a more peaceful, a more bloodless transition from the Islamic Republic to a secular democratic system, then that's why it matters. Otherwise, it's just Monday morning quarterbacking. It's just like reading a spy novel, and it's just sort of gawking at the expense of more suffering of the Iranian people. And I think that's why everyone who cares about this, whether it's Ms. Ansari or myself or anybody else, is thinking about it from that first perspective. If these rifts do exist, how can those be exploited to help the Iranian people?
Pegah?
Yeah, I think I would echo the last part of what Cameron was saying about the only part of it mattering really is whether or not it was intentional and a quote unquote inside job. But I will also say that, like I said at the beginning, there's still so much that we don't know. I'm still not convinced that we have all the facts. I think there's a lot of information that is
Or
gonna
that
come
we
out,
ever will.
or that we ever will. Yeah, for sure. But I think over the next few days, and as we've seen with the Islamic Republic, sometimes not even intentionally, but because they really don't know what it is that they're doing, sometimes there's information that's leaked, there's new information that comes to light. So there's going to be a lot that we're going to see. And I think the upcoming election is also going to shed light on whether or not this is, as a result of that infighting or the different factions or whatever else.
Bahador, what did you think of the Supreme Leader's response? It was actually bizarre watching the video of it, watching him. It was in Persian, obviously. It was kind of like, dude, make an effort to care. Pretend to make do a better job of acting at least. But again, as I said in my intro, for me, it was a signal, it was a shot across the bow to anybody, to Iranians inside the country and beyond. Don't think this is going to change anything, anybody.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And I think it speaks volumes. Like when you hear a statement like that, even if you're not Iranian, you have to, you see it for yourself, and nothing really changes in terms of the dynamics and the way this regime operates. They're just going to replace this guy with another thug just like himself. And as Khamenei says, like, I'm the boss here, right? He's dead. It's over. But nothing's going to change, right? But going back to the previous point about how this happened, if that makes a difference, I agree with what Nazenin and Cameron said. Yeah, it definitely does make a difference.
Why does it make a difference to you?
Because it's important how it happened, right? Like if this was just an accident compared to whether there was like a foreign hand involved, or whether it was a domestic or internal kind of power
Sorry,
struggle.
what's a foreign hand? Are we talking about the Israel, the U.S.?
I don't use a name of a country because.
Okay, but what is it? What would be the scenario?
It could be potentially Israel, right? I'm not saying it is.
Okay,
but I'm saying these possibilities are there, right? And if that is the case, if the Islamic Republic knows that it was Israel, they will never admit to it. And Israel itself would never admit to it, because you just killed a foreign minister, and no matter how awful these guys were, you plotted to kill the president and the foreign minister of a country. And if the Islamic Republic knows that, they're like, we'll never admit to it, right? So that's why I think we'll never know.
That just feels so much less likely to me than an inside job.
I don't think that's the look. If I were to go with the most likely scenario, I think it is something within the Islamic Republic, right? As was already discussed. But I'm saying if it was a foreign entity or whatever, we'll never really know, because even when the Islamic Republic finds out, it is incredibly embarrassing for them. They would never admit to it.
All five of us have a stake, it occurs to me, in wanting to educate, not to necessarily elevate ourselves as the educators, but in wanting to play a role in helping to explain to our communities, the non-Iranian communities, the greater world, even Iranians in the diaspora, to try to move information, to explain what this regime is like, what has happened in Iran over the last 45 years, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when something like this happens and we consume what's happening in the Western media, it's difficult to watch, and I that's where I immediately go, what can I do? How can I try to explain to people that what's happening here is kind of bizarre? And that my first experience with that in this case was on the night of, in the hours before the official confirmation of death had happened, which was the wee hours here in Canada, in Toronto anyway. Our time here, it would have been like 1, 2 in the morning. So there's been a crash. We don't know exactly. I mean, it would be counterintuitive to think that anybody was alive, but still they were doing their due diligence. And I was watching, I was flipping back and forth different cable networks, news networks, and the tone was remarkable. Now this wasn't necessarily Christian Amanpour. These weren't people who are at least supposed to be educated on the region, and they're not Iranian background, et cetera. So maybe they can be excused for not really knowing who Raisi is or something like that. But anchors with a reverential tone, as if like Angela Merkel has just died or something, kind of going, we've just gotten word that there may be a death to the soft hush tones. There's been a tragedy, etc. And again, as I was saying at the top of the episode, it's inconceivable to think if these anchors were talking about Pol Pot or Idi Amin or Mussolini, even Saddam Hussein, they wouldn't be speaking of them. And it was so telling. Think of the reaction to Osama bin Laden when Osama bin Laden was killed by the Americans. It was jubilance. I mean, anchors were like high-fiving, So it's clear that whatever work we think we've done in terms of educating our broader communities about the regime in Iran through all those protests and Masa Amini and Women Life Freedom, that in the case of these cable networks, at least, they didn't see Raisi that way. Bahador?
Yeah, exactly. They don't see it that way. But at the same time, I'm not surprised. It doesn't shock me at all. Like, we should be used to this by now. A lot of journalists in the West will even take a stance that appears to be very pro-Islamic Republic. Like, I don't know why people are like shocked by this, right?
Well, I'm not necessarily surprised, but I think it's important for us to address this.
Of course, yeah, and that's what I always say.
If we don't do something about it, who's going to?
I think we all have a duty to educate non-Iranians about what goes on in Iran and what happens in the Iranian society with the Islamic Republic itself. And we have to be very calm and fact-based about it, because a lot of times I see people get triggered and angry and they start cursing the person's family, and I'm like, no, this is not going to make them understand the situation better. You have to be calm. You have to remain, just don't lose your temper, and try to just lay out the facts as much as you can to educate other people. We have a duty to do that.
Nazenin, as I was watching those cable networks, I was sort of shaking my head thinking, you've got to be kidding. You seem to not have any idea who Raisi is and what this means to the Iranian people as you speak, as you're canonizing and revering this president who's died. Tell me about your experience with watching the Western media report on this in the last few days.
Well, BBC News was actually pointing out Raisi's record. So, but a couple of points. Number one, if this incident had happened in any Western country or in any open society, you would have rolling news all the time with people speculating on air, and it wouldn't finish. In Iran, it's not like that. It's as if it's finished, done. And that's because of the lack of, proper, open, free press. That's number one. Number two is that journalists don't have access to Iran, and as such have to rely on either secondhand information or today I attended the memorial service of the first female foreign correspondent, British foreign correspondent, Anne Leslie. And one thing that came to my mind during the memorial service was that she was one of the only ones, perhaps the only one, who didn't sell her integrity for the sake of access. And this is one thing that, we people who are not in the field of journalism don't realize, that journalists have to work for access. Anne Leslie I came to know Anne Leslie when she went to Rome and actually got into a fight. And this is in the early 2000s when Iran was still closed, but was trying to open up. So they were allowing foreign journalists to come into Iran. And she went to Rome and she visited the first, at that time, they had opened a center for human rights to reanalyze and try to have the perspective of an Islamist human rights. And she really got into a fight with the man there. And she came out and her reports were fabulous. Obviously, she was never allowed to go back. But other journalists, those covering the Middle East, they need to have access. There was another one I just have to mention, and she's also passed away, and that was Sue Lloyd-Roberts. She went to Iran. This is also in the early 2000s when Iran had opened its door, Islamic Republic, and wanted journalists to come in. And we worked together, and what she concentrated on was not the political angle, but actually the state of, the drug abuse, the AIDS center, and also young girls selling themselves on the streets of Iran.
Nazenin Jian, sorry to cut you off. You don't. Do you really need access to? I mean, for an anchor, admittedly a CNN anchor sitting in Atlanta or New York, they're far from the scene of the crime, but do they really need access at this point to know about what's happened in Iran for the last 45 years?
No, I agree. Not access to that sense, but access to officials for further news, to get news, to be able to cover. For example, when Sue Lloyd-Roberts was arrested in Iran, she managed to get the films out, and it really created a big brouhaha here in UK. But her reports weren't shown on BBC World. Why? Although they were shown on BBC Internal, not on BBC World, which was very important for her to show it, because at that time it was right before the invasion of Iraq, and BBC had listening posts on the border inside Iran, and they didn't want to lose their listening posts into into Iraq. So this is a quid pro quo. So this is when I say Anne Leslie was the only journalist, and Sue Lloyd-Roberts, that I have met and come across, that they haven't sold their journalistic integrity for the sake of the next news. If the next news comes, we want to be able to bring an official of the Islamic Republic on the stage. Well, that's what I meant.
Let me quote, Cameron, let me come to you. I want to quote a CNN correspondent. I don't even want to say his name because I don't want to necessarily demonize him, but a CNN correspondent in Tehran the last few days doing the reports about the public mourning. And this is over footage of, the men hitting their heads and that sort of milieu, that sort of crowd around the coffins, etc. And his report, he said, it's clear that this public procession, is extremely important to the people here in Iran.
There you go.
Goes on to talk about how the population is clearly moved by this. And you're kind of thinking, really? So, Cameron, tell me about how you respond to that.
Well, there are a few things I would like to say, but I think it's probably best I don't. 2 or 3 issues I think that we face. The first of which you've mentioned Pol Pot, and I want to come back to him because it's really important. There's an excellent American example we can cite about how the free world should respond to the death of such awful men like Ibrahim Raisi. First, the Iranian diaspora in the past 2 years has done so much work. In Canada, you've seen it. Here in the States, we've seen it. In the UK, we've seen it everywhere, educating people about what's going on in Iran, the crimes of the Islamic Republic. I don't think that the work that the Iranian diaspora has done in the past 2 years is less than, let's say, what the Cambodian diaspora did after the murders of Pol Pot, to elicit a response from Bill Clinton when he was president, when Pol Pot died, which was not a condolence, which was talking only about Pol Pot's victims, which was multiple paragraphs listing in detail the crimes that he and his regime had committed. That was a proper response. And I don't think it was because the Cambodian, I'm not an expert in Cambodia nor the Cambodian diaspora, but I find it difficult to believe that the Cambodian diaspora at that time was more mobilized, more influential, more active.
First
than
of
the
all,
Iranian
a
diaspora.
third of the country, a third of the country had been murdered.
Yes.
And no, they weren't galvanized that way.
But my point is to say exactly that this, I think there's a tendency to say, well, Iranians have to do a better job educating people. Iranians have done a very good job educating the media, their elected officials. So perhaps we can do better. We can always improve.
So why doesn't it stick?
So
like we just had like Women Life Freedom, like Masa Amini was less than 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Why, and was a global movement that some of these same networks were reporting on. How do you square that with let me quote again, it's clear that this public procession is extremely important to people here in Tehran. This is the news that's going around the world. While we go on Facebook or on Twitter and go, oh, what a bad guy he was. This is what's actually people are consuming around the world on CNN International, right?
There's two things. There's the journalists and then there's the elected officials. Because the elected official response at Nufti, my colleagues actually did a great job. They collected many of the responses, the good, the bad, and the ugly, they called it. Yeah. And the bad and the ugly was Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Kim Jong-un, the Chinese Communist Party, Putin, offering condolences. Mm-hmm. Alongside them was the United States Senate, was the United Nations, was NATO. These are the people who joined forces with the Taliban, with Hamas. So that's different, I think, than journalists. I'll come back to journalists and I'll be super brief. The elected officials who did that are not lacking information. In my view, they have an agenda because there are plenty of elected officials on both sides of the aisle. We had a Democratic congressman in the United States, Eric Swalwell, issue a damning, fiery statement against Raisi and saying that he hopes the people of Iran have freedom. So it's not just ideological. These people have an agenda, unfortunately, and you saw so many members of Congress here in the United States, so many elected officials, the MP in the UK, Tom Tugendhat, multiple times attacking those offering condolences to Raisi's victims. So there are elected officials who get this. So the elected officials or the entities who are offering condolences, in my view, aren't lacking information. They have an agenda. And to Ms. Ansari's point, the CNN journalist who's reporting from Iran, if he offers real reporting, if he says that in the Tehran metro area, there are probably 15 to 20 million people who live there, and the fact that a few tens of thousands of people showed up is a minuscule percentage of that overall population, especially when you consider
he's not going to be in the country too long.
He's not going to be in the country too long. He's going to be kicked out. So this is the access journalism that Ms. Ansari is talking about. So people like that who are spineless and who don't really care about ethics, but care about their access to some place, it shouldn't be shocking. And same thing for the politicians who are looking for some agenda, whether it's to have a JCPOA 2.0 or whatever it is. I mean, it's embarrassing, it's pathetic, it's shocking, it's shameful. And Iranians in the diaspora, I think, can do more, but they've done quite a lot. I think at this point, it's not on the diaspora to say you haven't educated enough. It's on those politicians to say you are making the unethical, immoral decision to offer condolences to a man who's slaughtered thousands of people personally. I don't think it's Iranians' fault. I think it's those people's fault, and it's their lack of ethics.
Let me come back to the officials, the government officials, et cetera, in a moment. But first, Pegah, I'll give you a chance to talk on this.
Very briefly, I was just going to say that I think when an entity like the UN legitimizes an individual like Raisi by holding a 1-minute moment of silence in a General Assembly, then what do we expect from the average reporter? And this is not to discredit any of those journalists or reporters or anchors or anything like that, but what is it that we expect from someone who, like you said, is not well versed, is not a Christian Amanpour, and is just taking direction from some of these entities and some of these elected officials who have an agenda, like Cameron said. So I think, I'm not shocked by it, but I think the expectation should be on those entities and those elected officials, and maybe less so on the Iranian diaspora. But I think we should still be continuing what it is that we're doing. I think every single one of us still has a responsibility to continue to educate.
Cameron, because you're in Washington, I mean, and you deal with these people. I mean, the American government, et cetera, to a certain extent. I was you just talked about it a moment ago on the JCPOA. I mean, I was very curious about the White House statement.
Mhm.
It was such a study in kind of bullshit, sort of. First of all, the Biden administration expressed official condolences. That's what it was called, over the death of Raisi and his delegation. And then they seem to, in the same statement, be going out of their way to kind of, the State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller acknowledged the death and then reaffirmed the U.S.'s commitment to supporting the Iranian people's struggle for human rights and fundamental freedom. And it was kind of like, why the fuck are you making a statement at all? Like, what if you're so, if you're trying to undo what you're saying, but is there some mandatory resolution somewhere in the international space that says you have to, give your official condolences to a government that you're not supposed to have any official ties with or discussions with anyway? This to me seemed like, oh, we got to save the nuclear deal somehow. I mean, I couldn't make any other sense of it. What do you make of that sitting there in Washington?
I think that's part of it. I think it's also that this is the people who staff this administration. I'm sure they're fine people. I'm sure they're good people. But these are the people who care about polite company. They care about being invited to the cocktail party. They care about being considered classy or intellectual or whatever. And so that makes them just spew lots of BS. That makes them just say whatever they think the United Nations would say, because they're not looking for facts. They're not looking for what's actually happening. They're looking for what's acceptable, what's appropriate, what's going to get me, make those fancy European diplomats with their nice ties and their French cuff shirts accept me at the next fancy Austrian hotel that we go and spend several weeks to flirt with Javad Zarif at. That's what they're thinking, because they're trying to advance that agenda. So for them, it would be more vulgar not to offer official condolences than it is vulgar for Ebrahim Raisi to slaughter thousands of Iranians. So it stems from them wanting to be a part of the cool kids club, want to be at the table, want to be part of polite company. But the path that it leads them down is a path of absolute amorality and legitimizing a criminal regime, and trying to prop up a criminal regime with another nuclear deal that will offer billions of dollars to use against the people of Iran and to use against their own countries, to use against the United States, to use against the Western powers. So these people are so caught up in trying to be polite and thoughtful and fancy and intellectual that they are totally devoid at the end of morals, because the actions that they take have real human consequences for the people of Iran and for others.
Bahador?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Cameron there. And the part that I say about educating people, I'm talking about the average person. I'm the average person who is being fed these lies by the media and by all the stuff that we just talked about. Because who are the people that I can influence? My platform gathers people who are interested in languages and cultures, right? And a lot of them barely know much about Iran, but they're interested. So when I talk about like educating people, I'm referring to these people who are living, whether it's in the West or anywhere in the world, who are fed these lies and these, pathetic propaganda of the Islamic Republic, and they just come here and they see something else. And as far as politicians go, journalists go, unfortunately, just as Cameron mentioned, they have an agenda. There's an interest there for them to go after. Our struggle, our cause as Iranian people, doesn't matter as much. it's sad to say this, but that's the reality. They don't care, whether what Raisi has done. We know he's a criminal. They know it. A lot of them know it as well, but they don't care because they have an agenda and have other interests.
Or there's another version of whataboutism now, which is, well, what about what the Americans have done, or what about this country, or what about that country?
Exactly.
And to which I want to talk about the UN. Did you want to say something? You moved too close to the microphone. I thought you were going to say something.
I was just going to say, this conversation reminds me of, less than 2 years ago when we were at the height of the Women Life Freedom Movement. Just the slogan just came to mind, where a lot of people were echoing on social media and things like that, that the smell of oil is stronger than the smell of blood. And I know that's, one of those statements that was very perhaps overly dramatized, but really that's what it comes down to, is that, like Cameron said, a lot of these elected officials are very well aware of what's going on. A lot of these journalists even are very well aware. Definitely the UN is very much aware, but there is an agenda, and that agenda takes precedence.
Can I ask you all about that? I'll start with you, Nazenin, John, about the UN, because there's a paradox around how we're supposed to deal with this UN. It seems I posted a video yesterday where I talked about the hypocrisy of the UN lowering its flag and the moment of silence and all that, more than the moment of silence, pointing out all of the ways that the Islamic Republic has abrogated the articles of the Charter of Human Rights, Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations, and the video, I mean, it's got a lot of traction, probably less than a day, got 100,000 views and lots of comments. Many of the comments saying, screw the UN, shame on the UN, fuck the UN, we should give up on the UN, etc. So, you kind of go, okay, well, what we should just not care about the UN then, I mean, let's stop going down. But who cares about the UN? We do. When for months and months, remember, we wanted Iran to be, there was that delegation that worked so hard to get Iran removed from the status of women, Iranian UN group or something like that. I mean, when there's a declaration by the UN, or there's some sort of vote that goes in the favor of recognizing the struggle of Iranians inside Iran by the UN, we all want to trumpet it. So we're caught in this difficult position. How do you process that, Nazenin?
Well, I mean, as you mentioned, Iran was, the Islamic Republic, the regime, was elected to be the chair of the Human Rights Council. That in itself is comical, but it's UN is, of course, an international body, but at the same time, worse than UN was NATO's statement. NATO, I mean, the regime is selling drones and weapons to Russia to fight in Ukraine, and NATO is actually fighting on the side of Ukraine, but still it comes and issues a statement. So it's as if we're living in this parallel world. But of course, I think one reason about the UN aside, it is comical, and UN. You have the special rapporteur, the UN special rapporteur for Iran, that is issuing all these records and year after year about the human rights abuses. But at the same time, you have the structure of the UN, which is kind of archaic, and it is contradictory. But I think one thing we need to also pay attention to is this unprecedented geopolitical turmoil that that all these countries are involved with. Cameron pointed to JCPOA too, and they are really afraid that these clerics, they will have, they will get their hands, not only their hands on becoming, to have a nuclear weapon, but also use it. So it seems that they are caught, in a blackmail. And this is what I think, all of these contradictory statements coming out. But also one other point, if I may, Iran has a lot of different social strata. And obviously those who speak English, those who are, and many of these personalities who work either at the UN or at foreign media, international media, who are Iranian. They engage with a special strata of the Iranian society, and they want to keep those, that kind of a connection. But at the same time, it is, I think, this law of unintended consequences. That this kind of engagement as well, although it will delay what has to happen, a change of regime, but at the same time, it is bringing more awareness and more schism at various different levels of society inside Iran. Because where the Iranian society at the moment is, and this includes even the most fundamentalist clerics within the regime, they know that the system is no longer functioning and that there has to be a regime change. Things cannot go on as they are doing, whether it's because of sanctions, whether it's because of lack of resources to divide up amongst themselves. But everyone knows that this machine is no longer, the engine is not working. And that is a lot to do also with the type of engagement. I remember actually on that night that we were getting the news from about the helicopters, two returning home, but one having disappeared and they didn't know where. In Clubhouse, there was one Iranian, prominent Iranian journalist working for one of these prominent Western media. She had her mic open, and suddenly we heard she was saying, "Hey, go tell so and so in her publication, don't go and interview any of these." She named Masih Alinejad or any of these other crazies, that they shouldn't interview dissidents. So this is the type of situation that we're involved with. It's a real battle of ideas, battle of integrity, and battle of aspirations. And every day that this regime stays in power, the opportunity costs for Iran is greater and greater because they're selling our future and our lives.
Let me just stick on the UN for a second, because it's I'm genuinely curious to hear what you all think. Cameron, should we give up on the UN?
There are good people working within the UN. I mean, you mentioned the Iranians who worked so hard to kick the regime off, the Commission on the Status of Women. Of course, they shouldn't have had to work that hard because the Islamic Republic should have never been on that commission in the first place, which points to the real problem. There are other good people like the Special Rapporteur, Dr. Javid Rahman. He was here visiting with us a few months ago. I think he's a very well-intended person. He's got a lot of integrity. He cares about exposing the Islamic Republic's crimes against the people of Iran. What he was saying here was, please push the US government, push other leaders within the UN to expand my mandate, to give me more authorities. So he is working within what I think is a failed and largely corrupted system. So his hands are tied. He can only do so much. He's trying to do good work, but he can only do so much because of the fundamental flaws within the United Nations. When you have regimes like the Chinese Communist Party, like Putin's Russia on the Security Council, controlling so much, when they can buy up with their dollars the positions of prime committee chairmanships or what have you, it's a fundamentally flawed institution. I don't know without regime change at the UN if anything can actually happen there. Because it continues to work.
We need regime change in so many places.
Yeah. Well, first we'll do Iran, and then we'll go to the UN.
Either of you want to come in on the UN question?
No, I don't think it's as I've said before, we can't really depend on anybody. If our goal is to take down the Islamic Republic, and I could be wrong. Like I honestly, like, I'm not saying that this is a perfect statement, but we can't depend on the UN. We can't depend on the European Union. We can't depend on some foreign government to give us a hand, because they don't care about us. I'm sorry to say this. They don't care about the problems of the people inside Iran. They care about themselves and they care about their own interests.
Everybody agree with that?
I'll just add my 2 cents. I think us giving up, quote unquote, on the UN would be more detrimental to the end cause or the end goal. I think, what we've often talked about here is we're not having our voice heard. And if we give up on such a large entity, a global organization like the UN, then we're limiting ourselves from being heard in such a large platform.
Giving up is a strong word. I would say more like don't depend on them to give
Yeah.
you.
To
But
the point of
I mean,
not,
go ahead, Cameron, and then Nazanin. Go ahead.
to the point of not relying on anybody else, I think that's right, but with a very important and very large caveat, if I can. Iran, I think, should be saved by Iranians. The people of Iran, whether they're inside the country or in the diaspora, working together, have to liberate and save Iran from the Islamic Republic. And every person, every country, every leader, of course, ideally, cares about his or her own country first. So it shouldn't be shocking that the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom cares more about American interests or British interests than he or she does about Iranian interests. That's natural. That's what he or she was elected to do. But I do think that if and when Iranians step up, as they have so much and have sacrificed so much over the past several years and will continue to do, and show that they're willing to fight for their country, and if we in the diaspora can find certain allies, and I think they exist in Washington, I know they exist, I'm sure in Canada and the UK, elsewhere they do exist. If we can find those allies and not just tell them a Cry Me a River story of, oh my gosh, look what's happening in our country, it's so sad, but explain to them why and convince them why it's in their interests to support the people of Iran, I think that their help will make this change so much easier, so much less costly for us. So that I think is the perfect combination. Relying on Iranians, but trying to find our allies when it is in their interest as well.
I 1000% agree with the idea that we're alone, and I've done essays about it. How that's not rely on anybody, but we wish that they wouldn't keep enabling. That's the problem. And honestly, to Cameron's point, I do believe that if we change minds, if we have, if there was some global movement for freedom and democracy in Iran, it would affect the way governments policy towards Iran and Western governments, et cetera, because we've seen that. We've seen how with Ukraine, I've said this a couple of times on the show, but they changed the logo of the Premier League, the British Soccer League, football league, changed the logo to a Ukrainian flag. We can talk about the amount of global support for the struggle of Palestinians, whether you agree with it or not. Why couldn't that be the case for the Iranian people, the young Iranian women who were leading the way just 2 years ago and continue to do so? That stuff would surely affect the Biden administration or the British government, or would it not, Cameron?
I think it would. I think it also goes back to their interests. What's in their interest? What's easy for them? What's sexy in the media? So I think that certainly the more bold, the more active that Iranians are, and Iranians inside the country have sacrificed immensely. Thousands of lives have been stolen in the fight for Iran's liberation, and I think that they will continue to show that bravery, that courage until Iran is free. So the more that we can do to support them, the more that we can change minds. I think that sort of these international solidarity movements, maybe the Iranian cause will one day be on the same levels of the anti-apartheid cause that was in South Africa, or what we're seeing now for some of the causes. But I think even if the Premier League doesn't change its logo to the Shiro Khorshid flag, which would be amazing, I think more importantly is can we convince the next American administration to change its policy? Because what really matters is the fact that sanctions on the Islamic Republic are not being enforced, and the Islamic Republic is having every day billions and billions of dollars more in oil revenue to do whatever it wants. So I hope we can get the Champions League. I hope we can get
I'm willing
NFL,
to personally,
anyone.
I'm willing to personally sew the Shiro Khorshid onto the Arsenal players' jerseys if they will do that for me. Nazanin, I'm sorry, I had you next. You go ahead.
No, I mean the only regime that doesn't think about its own people is the Islamic Republic. All countries, their first national interest is the quality of life for their own people, except the Islamic Republic that is doing it the other, opposite. But let's not forget, during the Women Life Freedom, there was unprecedented international support. The French Parliament rose up. If you remember, all the deputies rising up. We had unprecedented international support. I think, as Cameron said, and as your Pegah and your other guests mentioned, it depends on us as well. We need to bring about change ourselves, and they will support us. I think, the time will come again, and I think they run in opposition. The movement has become more mature in its approach, and that they will realize that it is together that we will stand, and divided that we will fall. So, and certainly, as Cameron mentioned, there are policies that they can actually follow, like implementing more sanctions, putting the IRGC on the sanctions list. But lastly, I want to also mention that Britain, UK, didn't issue a statement of condolences for Raisi. So Britain realizes the difficulty and the danger that the Islamic regime is posing, and the human rights.
I guess we need a Nazenin Ansari here in Washington, D.C. That was what kept.
Well, Canada didn't either, but I mean, when you talk about the unprecedented support that the world was showing, yes, here in Canada, the Prime Minister at some point walked in one of the demonstrations as part of the Massa Amini demonstrations alongside Hamid Ismailion. Canada still didn't put the IRGC on the terrorist list. So in terms of any real decisions or policy decisions of consequence, never happened still. And that was the proof in the pudding, it felt like. I'm so grateful to all of you. I want to finish off with one question to all of you that it's an interesting time to have this conversation, because on the one hand, there's a lot to discuss. On the other hand, we're right in the middle of things. And who knows whether this conversation will actually be terribly out of date 24 hours from now when something else happens, triggered by these events. But if I can put it this way, what are the most important next steps that you will be watching for in terms of the way things roll out in the coming days? I'll start with you, Nazenin, then Bahador, then Pegah, and finish with Cameron. Go ahead, Nazenin.
Certainly, more news is coming day by day. I am, for me, it's like real thriller, and it does make a difference what the different factions are, what their end game is. But also, I am hoping that we will see a more vibrant Iranian opposition, the movement. We're hearing more about it. And yes, that's I am hopeful for the Iranian people that they will have their support once again from us in the diaspora.
Bahador, what will you be watching for in the coming days?
In terms of what's been happening, I'll keep following to see if we gain any more details.
Will you be getting your news at CNN?
Well, actually, I don't follow, but I go and look at a lot of the pro-Islamic Republic propaganda accounts just because I want to know what's going on in their minds.
And what do you find?
And I see that a lot of them are, I would say, confused. They don't buy the actual official accident news. So that tells me a lot. So I'm going to be looking a lot into that and see how that goes.
And I recommend you to come and visit Kayhan London. We carry the latest ones as well.
For sure. Yeah. And as far as in the big scheme of things, in the big picture, I'm going to continue doing what I can, and I highly recommend, I would tell any Iranian I come across, please don't feel pessimistic. Keep doing what you can. Be optimistic and keep spreading and educating people as much as you can, because we will eventually win. But it's a difficult road that we're taking, but we will. Just keep going.
By the way, if you were in that position of my friend that who works and said that the boss came and said condolences, do you use that opportunity to educate?
Absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, because on the one hand, of course, we're supposed to do that, but I feel bad too at the same time that she was saying, I can't believe I have to do this every time.
No, no,
Not at all.
I have to like take my,
I get
I have to
excited
play the role of,
yeah.
Yeah,
When
me
I come across people who are not who are very misinformed about Iran, I actually get excited. I'm like, oh, let me tell you things that you really don't know. So don't like I come across people who are like, oh, I heard this and I didn't have the energy to say anything. Like you just have to say a couple of sentences. Like it doesn't.
Isn't this podcast called Roqe? Come on,
they would only listen. My friends don't listen, Cameron. We have hundreds of thousands of listeners. None of them are my friends, it seems. Go ahead.
First off, before I even mention, what I'll be looking forward to hearing more of or finding out more on, I would just say that I definitely agree with Bahador, and I would take every opportunity. And in fact, I've had the same thing happen in my workplace because I've had bosses and colleagues and things like that, and I've taken the time, sent them links, gone as far as providing them sources and things like that because I think it's really important. I think it's vital even for us to make sure that we're educating those closest to us and those, that you work with, more importantly. But in terms of what I will be looking out for, from inside Iran, I think it'll be really important to see what'll happen in the next 50 days leading up to the election on June 28th. I think looking at who the candidates who will come to light are, what will happen with Khamenei's son being a very vital individual in what will happen within the next 50 days, all of that will be really important. And also to see what actually comes out in terms of this helicopter crash. I think there's still so much that we're going to hear about what really happened. So that's what I'll be looking at inside Iran. Outside Iran, I would love to keep an eye on, the different governments, whether it's the US government, the Canadian government, the UK government, to see if they change their stance or their statements or anything like that. And also how much more coverage there will be on this and if the diaspora will have an impact on how much more coverage we'll have on this.
By the way, I realized that I didn't get to one point that you wanted to talk. The one thing you said you wanted to talk about, I didn't let you talk about, which is you say that you were not as enthusiastic about the people you saw celebrating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know about many other places in the world, but here locally in Toronto, there was gatherings at different locations where people were dancing and playing music and things like that. And I want to preface this by saying that I understand the happiness, I understand wanting to celebrate, but I've always said I think more practical actions are more helpful. I think there's always been campaigns for dancing and things like that on social media, and it gets lost in the midst of the type of world that we live in. And if we really do want to educate, I think there's other ways that we can do it. By all means, be happy. I'm not saying we should be sitting here mourning the death of someone like Raisi, but as we've mentioned on this panel and on this show many, many times, there's really so much to be done in order for us to get to the goal of getting rid of the Islamic Republic.
Yeah, I'm not someone who delights in Schadenfreude, but with Raisi, I also understand the desire of those who want to celebrate. Cameron, you get the last word in Washington.
Luckily, at my workplace, I don't run into too many people who don't know that much about Iran. So I'm lucky in that situation. They tend to know more than me, if anything. What I'll be watching for in the next few weeks is really the participation levels in the so-called elections that the Supreme Leader has called for some 46 days from now, and how that's covered in the West. Because I think that Iranians will use it as an opportunity to once again, on a mass scale, exert significant civil disobedience, which is the ultimate way to overthrow the Islamic Republic. And I think what we have to do as the diaspora is to highlight the sacrifice that they're making not to vote. It does come at a cost. It's perhaps one of the less costly means of civil disobedience, but nonetheless, it comes at a cost. The Islamic Republic is going to try to drag people into the streets to vote, to hold them accountable, threaten them if they don't vote. So when Iranians do make that bold move not to participate in these sham elections in this kabuki theater, we abroad have to promote that. We have to highlight the sacrifice that they're making, the bold move that they're making, and ensure to the extent that we can, to the extent that the ideologies or the ideological barriers or the agendas of some politicians or some journalists at the New York Times say don't get in the way. So they're going to be making this sacrifice, and we have to do what we can to ensure that it's properly reflected.
Well, I really enjoyed that conversation. That was really great. Did anybody have anything that you didn't get to say? I don't want to. One of the articles of the DHR is for freedom of expression. So I don't want to make sure that
I think
I allow everyone free speech.
One final quick note. One thing that I disagreed with Cameron, and I respect
Finally.
Cameron.
Finally, someone disagrees with Cameron.
In that case, I'm leaving. I'm out of here.
and with a lot of respect that I have for Cameron and everything that I agreed with, but as far as the justice for Raisi being taken to a court, an actual court, and being tried, I think that this was actually a better way for him to go because he died and suffered dying the same way he made thousands and thousands of people suffer. And for him to just kind of go to court and be tried, and I personally don't think it would have really caused as much suffering. I'm not one to say like I want people to suffer, but the suffering of laying there for hours and hours, being eaten possibly by wolves and bears, what court of law would have brought that kind of justice? I think this was divine justice for the suffering that he caused for thousands of people. And you could disagree with that, but
I would have to disagree with you, Bahador, on that.
The worst suffering that he had to go through was probably listening to Abdollahian try to speak English to the Turkish people who were trying to come and save them.
Wow, that's dark humor here. Well, but Cameron, I mean, it's an interesting point, though. I mean, because I actually hear what you're saying, Bahador. That's
because I just don't think that if he had gone to court, and what's the worst thing, they would have said, okay, we capital punishment, just quickly kill him.
But prior to capital punishment, it would have been shedding light on all the atrocities, all of everything that he had done.
To him? How would he have suffered from that?
Well, I mean, ultimately, if we're looking at capital punishment, he would have been dead anyway. So the end goal would.
I don't think someone like Raisi is concerned about being shamed.
No, I don't think he would be concerned about it. I think the point of due process and going through a trial is to inform not only the people of that country, but the masses, and to reflect on the atrocities that this individual committed. I think it's more so. It goes back to the same thing that we talk about many times on this show about education and about educating not only Iranians but the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Now, look,
and Bahador, how do you know that it wasn't quick? That's the thing. We don't know. It might have been instantaneous.
Right.
Whereas standing just like.
I want to die that way.
It's the best way to go, instantaneously, without any pain, without any shame. Whereas, if he would stand in a court of law, whether it be an international court of justice or whether inside Iran, he would have had to, face his victims.
But Nazenin, if he was eaten by wolves,
he would have been there. Oh, well.
Imam Reza was there to protect him, so he was probably
the poor wolf. The poor wolf.
Thank you, all of you, and I really appreciate Pegah as ever, our stalwart smart Pegah here. Bahador, thank you. Always great to have you on the panel. Cameron, it's such a pleasure to have you on the program. Always your sage insights are appreciated. Thank you. And Nazenin, our returning champion, you are
very much
always a joy to have you, and hope to see you in London before too long.